So let's look at the NBA and the NHL to return this summer. So what can we expect from that? What we can expect for the Flyers? They are the 4 seeds. They don't have to get the 5 through 12 play on the Eastern Conference. So what could be ahead for them? And what do these bubble cities even look like? Joining us to talk all about that and more, Scott Laughlin, SiriusXM NHL Radio, joins us as all guests here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Scott, how you doing on this Friday?
I'm doing well, Josh. Thanks for having me again.
I appreciate you jumping on. So, off the top, the big question I think a lot of people have about what the NHL is doing is, what is really the plan for these bubble cities? Because they proposed a lot of cities, and I think it's fair to say that all of those cities they proposed have very different logistical situations.
No, absolutely. I think when you factor the COVID-19 numbers into it, I think when you factor in all the instability in some of these areas and the unrest, I think it's all got to be taken into consideration as to where they call the hubs to be. And I think that there's anything that possibly still could happen. I think that's one of the reasons why the report came out yesterday, that amidst the COVID-19 in particular, that maybe they'll take an extra couple of weeks before they get back for training camps, respectively, around the National Hockey League. So I think it's still really up in the air right now. And as we know, Josh, I mean, the way things have been going here for the past number of months, and this applies to sports and society in general, everything is a moving, fluid type situation that, you know, they don't necessarily have to get at it right now, but you still have to come back with some sort of a formulated plan. I think they've got that. I think I like it the more I think about it. And by way of comparison to the NBA return to play, which I think is a little bit more confusing for sure, I think that once we get past the qualifying round in the Stanley Cup playoffs and get to the final 16 for the official postseason to begin, I think we're going to start to see the wares of something good and something creative.
Speaking of creative, you know, when they initially announced this 24-team format and with, you know, the 5 through 12, they're jockeying for a position, and the 4 through 1 jockeying for a position. What did you think of it initially? Is it one of those things where you were like, you know, hey, I really like this, I'm on board, or did you have to warm up to it a little bit?
I had to warm up to it a little bit, and I really had to warm up to it a little bit, Josh, from the standpoint that, you know, a team like Philadelphia that's put itself into a bye position in the quote-unquote first round, while that qualifying round's going on, I just wondered about teams like the Philadelphia Flyers and how they might sort of gain some momentum, how they might keep an edge while the qualifying round is going on. Because let's face it, I mean, if you're a team that's playing in the qualifying round, you're fighting for your playoff lives, so to speak. I mean, you're fighting for your season to continue on and to go forward. If you're a team that's got a bye and you've already, in the case of the Philadelphia Flyers, kind of put yourself out there as one of the top teams in the Eastern Conference, you wonder if they're going to have the same to play for. But I think I've come around on that idea where they get to this round robin where the 4 top teams in the Eastern Conference, including the Flyers, get at it and play a little bit of a round robin. I've come around on it because they've announced that they're going to reseed. So you're actually playing for top seed, second seed, third seed, fourth seed, respectively, in the Eastern Conference, and you're playing for a better matchup come the opening round, if you will, in the round of 16. So I had some concern, I think, initially about the momentum that a team like the Flyers could generate by way of comparison to a team that's going to maybe play 3, 4, maybe even 5 games in the qualifying round. But I think that the qualifying round will be one thing, and the teams that are competing for the bye will be another. I think both will have momentum. Both will have the edge going in when it comes to getting back up to snuff physically, because I think that the teams like the Flyers are going to have something to play for now that they've officially announced that they're going to reseed and not necessarily go by the brackets like has been the case for a number of years now.
You mentioned the Flyers. To me, I think they're in a wonderful position because I think that the way they've played this year, Alain Vigneault has done an incredible job at, you know, really bringing all the pieces together. We know Carter Hart's an up-and-coming star. Them and then 4 through 1 spot really gives them an opportunity to get some really favorable matchups potentially in the first couple rounds.
I like this team. I like where this team's at right now. I like the future of this hockey team because I've seen some really good things happening this season. Number one, AV coming in. It didn't take long for the Flyers to respond to him. I think the relationship has been great from the get-go. He seems to have a good working relationship with the media, and that's never been in doubt with Alain Vigneault, who's a very personable type guy for sure. He's also the type of guy, Josh, too, around the National Hockey League that players generally over the years have said that they enjoy playing for. Yes, he's going to hold you accountable, but he is the type of guy that will be able to communicate with today's player which I think is very, very important. I like what Ron Hextall first did. I know towards the end, Flyers fans were getting a little bit impatient with Ron Hextall, who said when he came back from Los Angeles that he was prepared to be patient, to draft well, to develop the players well, and eventually they'd reap the benefits of all that. I think the Flyers are starting to see some of what Ron Hextall was promoting, and I like the fact that Chuck Fletcher has gone out and he has built upon what Ron had established, and he supplemented some of the youth on this team with the likes of a Hayes up front, and I think with the likes of a Justin Braun and a Matt Niskanen on the blue line, that has insulated a kid like Provorov. That's insulated a guy like Travis Sanheim. That's allowed them perhaps to play in more realistic type minutes in different types of situations from that standpoint because they have the experience now on the back end. Then you mix that all in with a competitive, viable veteran backup in Brian Elliott, who's been good when he's had to be. And, of course, Carter Hart has been as advertised. So where this organization is right now is pretty good, and I think it's got a potential down the road to be great. Knowing that some of these guys have stepped forward, they had hoped that the succession plan would include Konechny and Couturier taking the keys to the kingdom from the likes of Jake Voracek and the captain Claude Giroux, and I think that's exactly, Josh, what's happening so far in Philadelphia.
You mentioned the goaltender, Scott. I got to ask your perspective on this. I know a lot of people have wondered how would they handle the goaltenders coming back going into the playoffs because during the season, they've kind of had a balanced stagger, and Carter Hart has been much better at home than on the road. So what they've been doing sometimes they say, hey, maybe Elliott gets more road starts. So how do they handle that going into the playoffs, in your opinion?
That's a great question because so many teams out there do have a 1-1 ace type situation going in. You think about Columbus, you think about Calgary, you think about Edmonton, all these teams, even a team like Washington. Hope he's got the pedigree, but he's an impending free agent. And Ilya Samsonov, the young rookie, has done well in the 26 appearances that he's had so far this season, too. So maybe even for a guy like Holtby, the leash is a bit shorter than maybe it had been in previous playoff runs. But to answer your question, look, I think that the present for Philadelphia is Carter Hart. I think the future is Carter Hart. I would give him ample opportunity at home or on the road. In this case, it's going to be at a neutral site hub, too, so maybe you don't have to worry about it as much from that standpoint, other than maybe giving up last change if you're the road team. I think it's Carter Hart. I mean, you got to let him get his feet wet here in the Stanley Cup playoffs. He's done it internationally at the World Juniors. He had done it in the Western Hockey League playoffs. It's now time to let the kid go. Let him earn his stripes in the playoffs at the most important time of the season, and I think he's fully capable of handling that responsibility.
I know it's not an apples-to-apples comparison, but I feel like letting Hart go out there kind of reminds me what the Devils did back in the day, where they could go to Brodeur and say, look, you need to get the experience. Just go out there and play. And I think the Flyers could do a similar thing with Hart. I'm not saying Hart's going to be a Hall of Fame goaltender, but I do think there's a little similarity in the kind of the age when they both came up and the fact that they both have that kind of talent that differentiates themselves.
Well, that's a great example, too. It really is a great example because when Brodeur came in back in the early 1990s, you're right, it was all about getting him up to speed as quickly as possible. You knew that he was the present and he would be the future for the New Jersey Devils. Looking back on it now, in retrospect, I think we all see what everybody saw, and that was they were bang on with that assessment. So you're right. I mean, this is Carter Hart's time. And, again, Brian Elliott should be commended for the way he's played this season. I don't know that Brian Elliott, ever was really a 50 or a 60-game starter in the National Hockey League, although at times I think people have perceived him to be that guy. But he's bounced around mainly because of that. But I think he's found his role. I look at Brian Elliott much in the same way I look at a Jake Allen with St. Louis. Jordan Binnington's the man now in St. Louis, and that's not going to change. But if you need somebody to run with it for a couple of weeks or for a couple of games, Jake Allen has proven that he can be that guy, that 1A complement that Brian Elliott has turned out to be in Philadelphia.
Scott Laughlin joining us here on the Boardwalk on the hotline on 97.3 ESPN, SiriusXM NHL Radio. Scott, the 5 through 12 teams in both conferences, is there a team in those groupings? Because we know there's been numerous times now that teams that have been either an 8 or in that lower 4 that have gone on and won Stanley Cups, or at least going on and basically upset the entire setup of the playoffs. So is there a team in those 5 through 12s that you point to like, let me tell you something, you better watch out?
I got to say, let's take it over to the Western Conference. I got to say that 12 seed in the Western Conference, Josh, is pretty dangerous. I'm talking about the Chicago Blackhawks. The Blackhawks teased us pretty much all season long. They would drop 4 to 5, and then suddenly they'd win 6 out of 7. I looked at the Blackhawks in the same way I looked at Jason Voorhees from the Friday the 13th movies. just when you thought that it was done, hey, here comes the hand out of the water at the end of the movie, and you knew there was another sequel coming to that series. I looked at Chicago the same way all season long. They got a break, granted, and the fact that they're actually in the 2014 playoff format to begin with. They were thrown a bit of a bone that way from the National Hockey League. That said, when you look at their nucleus, and you look at Taves, and you look at Kane, and you look at Duncan Keith, and you look at Corey Crawford in particular, you look at those guys, Brandon Saad, you can throw him in as well, guys that have won Stanley Cups before, and guys that get a new lease on life against an Edmonton Oilers team that's not that proven when it comes to playoff success. They've got McDavid, they've got Draisaitl. Beyond that, we're not quite sure what you're going to get from the Edmonton Oilers on a nightly basis. So I think Chicago could be a very dangerous team in the Western Conference if they get through that qualifying round. Not sure, of course, after the reseeding whom they're going to match up with in the round of 16, but Chicago, based on reputation and pedigree and some of the future Hockey Hall of Famers that we alluded to here, at least I alluded to here, Josh, that's one dangerous team, the Chicago Blackhawks.
And what about a team in the East of that 5 through 12?
Well, I tell you what, I mean, I just look at the Eastern Conference in general as pretty much a bit of a crapshoot because I think that Boston clearly had separated itself to be the best team, not only in the Eastern Conference, but I think in the National Hockey League as well. And they did have to give a little bit to get into this format. They had a 6-point lead on their nearest competitors in the race for the President's Trophy. That's the team I'd probably worry about the most in terms of whether or not, as a veteran-laden team with future Hockey Hall of Famers themselves, by the way, that they can step on the gas again in case they might be vulnerable. I think that Tampa Bay's got a lot to prove. You just run up and down the list there. I think Toronto-Columbus is basically a coin flip at this point. In fact, at this point, I'd probably side with the Blue Jackets to win it, too. So, I don't know. I just look at the Eastern Conference as being pretty wide open, but the 4 teams that got the bye are there for a reason. They were the best during the regular season, and then you go from there and you see who can kind of regenerate and get things going again, knowing full well that we're going to be going into these series knowing that everybody is pretty much healthy. Everybody's starting from the same starting block. It's almost going to be like a new season altogether. If you're a goaltender or a team that's had a history of slow starts, you have a slow start this time around. All of a sudden, you're sitting around for the next 4 or 5 months waiting for next season to begin.
Scott, another topic that we've been talking about a lot this week, and we haven't had a lot of context on the NHL front on this point, is obviously it's been a lot in the news. We've been talking about it down here, is what's been going on with the main 3 sports that are in discussion, which is baseball, hockey, and basketball. And Gary Bettman said something very interesting with the financial thing, because in baseball, they're arguing basically over millions of dollars. Yeah. Basketball, the players are basically saying, we're working with the league, we got this. Well, I saw an interview with Gary Bettman. He said, look, we've negotiated our financial situation, so it's basically structured. There's really no discussion. How did hockey get to that point, Scott? Because it was just, 15 years ago, there was a whole season lost.
Well, it took them a long time to get to a 50-50 split, but that's essentially what they eventually got to. It took a long, long time for the players to get to that, where they're basically co-owners of the league with the National Hockey League itself. So, they've put certainly some safety measures in place from the owner's standpoint, from the league standpoint, vis-a-vis escrow, where revenues have to be at a certain point or else players are responsible for making up the difference. But essentially looking at a 50-50 split. And that's why it is impressive, not only, as you say, what the NBA's done, but what the NHL's done. I mean, I got to think baseball has got to come back, even if it's for 50 or 60 games. I mean, given the landscape and the environment right now with people losing their jobs left, right, and center, and the economy, of course, taking a huge hit for obvious reasons, I got to think baseball's smart enough to figure out some way to at least get on the field to play for a couple of months. Wouldn't look very good at all if, in fact, they miss playing their season as short as it's going to be, as abbreviated as it's going to be, if it's for something with regards to economics. Not going to look good at all. But for the NHL, look, we've heard from both sides, the Players Association and from the National Hockey League itself, that perhaps their relationship has never been stronger over the last couple of years. Now, they've still got to work out down the road an extension on the CBA. We are extended for a couple of years, but why not make it longer? Part of that's going to be Olympics, to go or not to go. That is going to be the question. The players seem to want to go. The NHL thinks it's more of an inconvenience. That's going to have to be negotiated going forward. We hope we see the NHLers back at the Olympics as early as 2022, but we'll have to wait and see on that one. But I think that, given the landscape, it would be incumbent on the National Hockey League and the NHLPA to come together and come out of this, arm in arm, saying that we're together, and not only are we together, but we're going to extend the CBA even further because we realize that we've got to build back up the revenues again because the league, like all leagues concerned, have taken a hit.
Great stuff from Scott Laughlin here. Follow him on Twitter at Laughlin SXM Series XM NHL Radio. And Scott, before I let you go, I got to give you credit because let me tell you something. Your morning skate all-time lineup for the Flyers is way better than your cohort because you actually put Desjardins and Prop in there, whereas your buddy over there didn't even give them any acknowledgement here.
Well, I think he was harkening back to the Cup years and wanted to recognize Joe and Jimmy, and that's all well and good. They were fantastic Flyers back in the day, but I mean, you want to talk about the numbers that Prop put up. I mean, first in junior hockey and then in the NHL with the Flyers mainly, of course. I couldn't overlook that. And Eric Desjardins, look at the numbers. I mean, Eric Desjardins had a great run with the Canadiens, and then that trade with Montreal brought him to Philly. And yeah, I certainly could not overlook him at all when it came to the back end for the Philadelphia Flyers. I was just shocked that my co-host Gord Stellick didn't pick Gritty. I thought he was leaning towards Gritty as his wild pick, but thankfully he stayed away from the mascot this time around.
Oh, my goodness. I love it. Well, folks can check you guys out on SiriusXM NHL Radio. And as all guests, Scott Laughlin appeared here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Scott, I'm sure we'll be touching base as the NHL finally gets back on the ice soon.
All right, I look forward to it. Thanks very much.